watch Chinese soldiers throw themselves against our line for 9 straight nights, believing the cold alone would finish what their numbers couldn't. And years later, I got to read in their own captured field report the exact words a Chinese officer used to describe what he found instead. He didn't call us brave. He called us ghosts who wouldn't freeze. I'm 94 years old now, and I still think about that phrase more than almost anything else from that whole war. A stranger, writing for his own commanders in his own language, trying to explain men like me in words that made us sound less like soldiers and more like something the cold itself couldn't touch. December 1950, Chosin Reservoir. I was 18 years old, off a farm in eastern Iowa, and nothing about growing up in that flat, quiet country had prepared me for what that mountain was about to ask of us. Ghosts who wouldn't freeze. That's what his own report called us. I'm here tonight because it was true. I grew up on a corn and hog farm in eastern Iowa, up before light most mornings, same as my father and his father before him. Winters cold enough that I thought I understood cold pretty well by the time I turned 18. I didn't understand a thing yet. Not really. I shipped out to Korea in the fall of 1950, assigned to a marine company that moved north into the mountains around the reservoir. Terrain and temperature that broke every assumption I'd carried over from an Iowa winter. There was a corporal in my squad, a steady man named Walter Elgin, who'd already seen combat further south before our unit moved up into that particular stretch of mountains. They're counting on this cold doing half their work for them, he told me the first night we dug in. Every man who freezes solid is one they don't have to shoot. Don't give them the easy kill. The Chinese came at us that first night in numbers I still can't put an honest count to, whistles and bugles echoing down off the mountainside before the mountainside itself seemed to start moving. Rifles jammed solid in that cold, bolts frozen tight, and more than one man in my squad worked a weapon, loose with hands too numb to properly feel what they were doing. Elgin kept moving low along our position, checking every man, making sure nobody had gone still in a way that meant something worse than exhaustion. I remember him crouched beside me at one point, breath fogging thick in front of his face, saying something I've never forgotten. Cold's trying to beat us before they do. Don't let it. We held that first night. I couldn't tell you exactly how, beyond simple refusal. 9 nights that siege stretched on, each one colder and longer than the last, the assaults coming in waves, timed to test whatever was left of us after the cold had already done its own quiet work. I lost feeling in 3 fingers on my left hand, somewhere around night 4. Didn't fully understand how bad the damage was until a corpsman checked me over and went quiet in a way that told me more than his words did. Elgin kept the squad functioning through routine alone. Check your weapon, check your feet, check the man beside you. Simple instructions repeated so many times over those 9 nights that they stopped sounding like orders and started sounding like something closer to scripture. I remember thinking somewhere around night 6 or 7 that we'd stopped being a squad holding a position and become something else entirely. Men who'd simply decided individually and together that this particular stretch of frozen ground wasn't for giving up. No matter what the numbers or the temperature suggested we should do instead. By the time relief broke through from the south, I'd lost track of exactly how many days we'd actually held that line. Long enough that the cold had become its own separate enemy, distinct from the soldiers coming at us through it. Long enough that Elgin's simple instructions had kept more men alive than any single tactical decision handed down from officers above us. We moved south with the rest of the column, fighting the whole way toward the port, toward ships that would take us out of a country that had taught every one of us something about endurance we hadn't known we possessed going in. I didn't think about what the Chinese command might have made of those 9 nights. I was too tired, too cold, too focused on simply staying alive through each individual hour to consider what our resistance might have looked like from the other side of that line. I came home to Iowa in the summer of 1951, 3 fingers on my left hand, never quite right again. A permanent reminder of 9 nights. I didn't talk about much for a very long time. My father asked me once, plain and direct, the way he asked most things, whether it had been as bad as the newspapers made it sound. I told him it had been colder than any newspaper could put into words. I didn't tell him much more than that. Wasn't sure yet, myself, how to describe 9 nights that had asked more of me than I'd known I had to give. Elgin and I stayed in touch over the following years. Letters, mostly. The particular kind of correspondence between men who'd shared something neither one fully knew how to explain to anybody who hadn't been standing beside them in it. Decades later, a historian researching the Chosin campaign reached out through a veterans organization I'd stayed connected to, sharing documents his research had turned up, including a translated excerpt from a captured Chinese field report describing the assault against positions like the one my squad had held. The report was clinical in most places, numbers and troop movements, the dry language of military record-keeping. But one line stopped me cold when I read it. Decades after the fact, sitting in my own kitchen in Iowa, the officer had written that his men had come to refer to the Marines holding that particular stretch of line as something that translated, roughly, to ghosts who wouldn't freeze, soldiers who should have broken under the cold and simply never did, no matter how many nights his forces threw against them. I read that phrase 12 times before I let myself feel anything about it. Not triumph over his frustration, not exactly. Something closer to a strange, quiet recognition that a man on the other side of that freezing line had watched us closely enough and been confused enough by what he saw to reach for a word like ghosts to explain it to his own commanders. Walter Elgin passed almost 15 years ago now, and I think about him most on the coldest nights of an Iowa winter, his voice still clear in my memory, telling me not to give the cold the easy kill. I sat with that translated phrase a long while after I first read it, understanding something that had taken over 60 years to fully settle into place. We hadn't survived those 9 nights because the odds were ever in our favor. We'd survived because men like Elgin refused, hour after frozen hour, to let the cold or the numbers decide the outcome for us. Refused so completely that even the men trying to defeat us couldn't find an ordinary word to describe what they were up against. That understanding sat in me quiet and steady, the way the truest things usually do. I took over my father's farm eventually, married a local woman named Dorothy, raised 3 children on that same Iowa ground, working it with 2 fingers on my left hand that never fully recovered their feeling, a small, permanent souvenir of that mountain I carried through every planting season since. Elgin and I exchanged letters right up until his passing, and I drove out to Ohio for his funeral, stood in a small church full of men who understood without needing it explained exactly what 9 nights at that kind of cold does to the men who live through them together. I never made much of a public thing out of that translated report. Told my children about it eventually, in pieces, the way most stories like this one get told across an entire lifetime instead of all at once. I've got great-grandchildren now who ask about the war sometimes, and I tell them about the cold and about Elgin's voice more than I tell them about the fighting itself directly. I tell them about a phrase written by a stranger in a language I never learned, describing men he couldn't explain any other way. That translated page sits in a drawer in my desk now, next to my discharge papers and a photograph of Elgin taken not long before we shipped home. Some winter mornings, hands aching in that particular way, old injuries ache in the cold. I take it out and read it again, still turning those 4 words over after all these years. Ghosts who wouldn't freeze, I suppose, in whatever way that mountain measured such things. He wasn't wrong.